Welcome in, everyone. We are absolutely thrilled.
Yeah, really glad you're joining us.
Now, you know the drill by now. You know what we do here. We take the source material that you are curious about, the specific pieces of media you send our way.
Right.
And we put them under the microscope, we break them down, pull out the core themes, and really try to figure out what is actually functioning beneath the surface of the text.
Exactly. We want to see how the engine runs.
Yeah. And today's mission is entirely custom tailored just for you. And I have to say, it's a fast.
It really is.
We are looking at a highly opinionated, incredibly culturally charged piece of media commentary. Our sole source for today's deep dive is a transcript from a YouTube video.
Just the one video.
Right. The video is titled "Fantasy Has a Serious Problem and Nobody's Talking About It." And it was uploaded by a fantasy author named John Del Arroz.
Now, before we jump into the mechanics of this video, I do need to step in and establish some really important ground rules for you, the listener.
Please do.
Because as we navigate this specific material well, the source we are analyzing today contains very strong, highly polarized, and explicitly politically charged opinions.
They're charged.
Right. The author makes some sweeping statements about gender, human sexuality, modern culture, and the inner workings of the global publishing industry.
He covers a lot of ground.
He does. And our mission in this deep dive is absolutely not to endorse, validate, or legitimize these views. We're also not here to take any political side, left or right, or even to argue against the author.
We're just looking at the text.
Exactly. Our role, strictly and impartially, is to report on the arguments being made in the video. We want to unpack the underlying logic, the rhetorical strategies, and the cultural anxieties the author is presenting to his audience. We are here to understand the anatomy of his argument. Nothing more, nothing less.
Exactly. We are looking at the architecture of how this specific argument... Okay, let's unpack this, because we're going to explore how a seemingly everyday, mundane complaint about the way physical books are arranged on a bookstore shelf rapidly.
And I mean rapidly.
Yeah, at breakneck speed escalates into a massive, sprawling discussion about Hollywood film adaptations, secret societal manipulation, the intentional destruction of the nuclear family, and the very definition of what constitutes real art.
The velocity of the escalation is really the most striking structural element of the transcript. It's a masterclass in how localized, highly relatable grievances can be utilized as a springboard to launch much larger, far more abstract cultural narratives.
I honestly had to rewind the video when I first started going through this transcript because the jump from a neighborhood bookstore to the collapse of civilization happens so fast it kind of gives you whiplash.
It really does.
But let's start exactly where the author starts. The video opens with a very relatable, very visual anecdote. John Del Arroz describes a recent trip he took to a Barnes & Noble.
A very normal starting point.
Right. He says he walked right over to the science fiction and fantasy section, which makes sense. That's his professional domain as an author.
Sure.
But what he observes there becomes the core grievance that fuels the entire remainder of the video. He claims that the entire section is completely overrun by what he calls romantic slop.
Or romantasy slop, as he puts it.
Right, romantasy slop. He looks across the display tables, he looks across the end caps and the shelves, and he tells his audience that everything, literally every single book being promoted in that space falls into this romantasy category.
With one exception.
Yes, there is one notable He points out to his viewers that there is exactly one shelf, just one, dedicated to the author, Brandon Sanderson.
Right.
And according to Del Arroz, Sanderson is essentially the only person representing traditional fantasy in that entire physical space.
Let's pause and really look at the rhetorical weight of choosing that specific location.
Yeah, why the bookstore?
The choice to begin the video this way is incredibly deliberate. Think about why he uses a physical Barnes & Noble as his anchor point. He is taking a very broad, very abstract complaint about the entire global publishing industry, and he is grounding it in a tangible visual reality.
Something anyone can picture.
Exactly. It's a shared experience that many avid readers, perhaps even you listening right now, might have had recently. When a cultural critic wants to convince an audience that a sweeping, somewhat invisible shift is happening, pointing to a physical space makes the abstract threat feel local.
It brings it right into your neighborhood.
It makes it feel undeniable. He's essentially saying, don't just take my word for it. Walk out your front door, go into your own neighborhood bookstore, and see the evidence with your own eye. It invites the viewer to participate in the observation, which lowers their critical defense.
It totally anchors the argument. And I actually want to ask you, the listener, to do exactly that mental exercise right now. Picture your own local bookstore. Think about the last time you walked down the fantasy aisle.
What did it look like?
Right. Have you noticed a visual shift in the cover? Have you noticed a change in the summaries printed on the dust jacks to expect epic fantasy?
Very specific trope.
Yeah, you'd see covers with imposing scaly dragons, heavily armored knights, swinging broadsword, sweeping mountainous landscape, and you'd open the book to find a densely drawn, intricate map of a fictional continent right there on the end.
That was the standard.
But now, there's undeniably been a visual shift towards beautifully illustrated covers, often featuring couples in intimate poses, pastel color palettes, and a much heavier focus on romance and interpersonal dynamics.
And the author of the video is taking that very real, observable visual shift and framing it not as a natural change in market taste, but as a deliberate problem.
A huge problem.
And that framing is the linchpin of his entire premise. Let's look closely at the implication of his claim that Brandon Sanderson is the only author representing the norm.
Right, Sanderson is huge.
He is. Now, for anyone who needs a quick refresher, Sanderson is arguably the biggest name in modern traditional epic fantasy. He's famous for writing massive, intricate tomes featuring what we call hard magic systems.
Which basically means magic that operates with strict, almost scientific rules and limitations.
Exactly, as opposed to a soft magic system where a wizard just waves a wand and anything can happen. Sanderson's work is heavily focused on sprawling world building and complex political systems.
So by setting Sanderson up as the solitary figure on a single shelf, holding the line against the rest of the bookstore, Arroz is creating a stark binary for his...
He absolutely is.
Wait, but is it fair to say he's creating a stark binary, though? Is he really saying it's just Sanderson versus the romance books? What about all the other traditional fantasy authors that are still obviously published?
That is exactly the rhetorical trick. By ignoring the other traditional authors that are undoubtedly still on those shelves, your George R.R. Martins, your Joe Abercrombies, your Tolkien reprints, he forces the viewer into a false dichotomy.
Ah, I see.
On one side, you have Sanderson standing as the lone avatar of traditional, acceptable, structurally rigorous fantasy. On the other side, you have everything else, which the author dismisses entirely and universally as romantic slop.
So he just lumps it all together.
Yes. This means that anything outside of a very narrow traditional epic fantasy mold is being categorized as part of an invasion. He's defining the norm incredibly narrowly, specifically to emphasize just how far he believes the genre has fallen.
It's a really aggressive way to set the stage. And what's really striking is how seamlessly he moves from that physical visual of the bookstore right into pointing fingers.
He doesn't hesitate.
No, he doesn't just sit there and lament that the market is changing or tastes are... He names the specific people he believes are responsible for this invasion.
What's fascinating here is that he doesn't just blame the current authors in a vacuum. He constructs a very specific, somewhat insidious lineage for this trend. He traces the DNA of this problem back to a very specific, well-known cultural moment, which gives his argument a sense of historical inevitability.
Right, which brings us to the evolution of what the publishing world now calls Romantasy and its undeniable roots in fan. According to the video, the current leaders of this Romantasy wave are the authors Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros.
Huge names right now.
Massive. He claims they are the pioneers who really pushed this aesthetic and this focus into the mainstream publishing world. But the source makes a very specific historical claim here. He traces the origin of this entire publishing trend directly back to the massive cultural phenomenon of Grey.
This is a crucial pivot in his argument. He is attempting to build a historical case that what is happening in the fantasy genre right now is not actually fantasy evolving, but rather an invasive species from a completely different ecosystem entirely.
Now, we all know the 50 Shades of Grey origin, right? It's famous.
Everyone knows it.
It started as Twilight fan fiction and turned into a publishing juggernaut. But what's crucial here is how Arroz weaponizes that for history. He uses it as the foundational blueprint for what he sees as a hostile.
How does he frame it?
Well, the way he describes this history to his audience is incredible. He explicitly reminds his viewers that 50 Shades began as a fanfiction based on Stephenie Meyer's Twilight saga. And he points out that Twilight itself was very PG, very tame, focused on teenage longing rather than explicit act. But then, in his own words, a degenerate woman began posting chapters online.
That word degenerate comes up a lot.
A lot. This fanfiction took the very tame, established characters of Bella and Edward and inserted them into highly explicit, BDSM-heavy sexual encounter. The author notes that eventually the names of the characters were changed.
They filed the serial numbers off, as they say.
Exactly. The vampire elements were entirely filed off, and this explicit fan fiction was packaged into a final product that mainstream publishers scooped up, which then, of course, became a massive, multi-billion-dollar Hollywood franchise.
The context here is vital for understanding the source's broader argument. He isn't just giving a history lesson. He is laying out a specific mechanical blueprint for how he believes mainstream publishing is being corrupted from the inside out. The claim is that fan fiction culture, which historically existed in the unmoderated, informal, and often very messy spaces of the internet, has successfully breached the walls of professional publishing. And more specifically, he is targeting the common practice within fan fiction of taking established, mild or non-sexual properties and injecting highly explicit sexual content into them.
Taking something innocent and changing it.
Right. He is arguing that this mechanism, this literal rewriting of the rules to force explicit material into spaces where it previously didn't belong, has become the new default business model for the mainstream industry.
And he takes that exact blueprint, the 50 Shades origin story, the tame to explicit pipeline, and he applies it directly to the career trajectory of Sarah J. Maas.
He draws a direct line.
The video claims that Maas's work followed a remarkably similar evolution path. Delara states that her series started out as what he dismissively calls girl bossy fan.
I want to jump in on that phrase, girl bossy.
Yeah.
You might think he's offering a slight concession there, acknowledging that her early work wasn't entirely explicit, but look at how he uses that concession.
She's setting a trap.
In a way, he only admits her early work was relatively tame, just focused on a strong female protagonist in order to make the betrayal of her later explicit work seem more severe.
That makes total sense. He admits this early girl bossy style made her mildly popular in the young adult space. But then, according to the source, she made a very conscious, calculated decision to up the ante.
When did that happen?
By the time she reached her 4th book in the series, which is A Court of Silver Flame, he claims she abandoned the YA pretense and went full-on erotica.
A major shift.
And the video points out that this sudden, drastic shift shocked and even alienated some of her original younger fans. But ultimately, from a commercial standpoint, it turned her into a massive, undeniable global bestseller.
Let's really extrapolate on the terminology he uses to describe this shift. He quotes a review that uses the phrase porn over plot, and that concept becomes central to his entire thesis.
Porn over plot.
He is arguing that the fundamental very structural integrity of the fantasy genre is being actively dismantled and overwritten. Traditionally, as we discussed with Sanders, fantasy has been defined by external adventure, macro-level world building, and high-stake click.
The map in the front of the book kind of stuff.
Exactly. The author's claiming that these foundational pillars are being stripped away, hollowed out, and replaced by explicitly softcore pornography. And crucially, and this is a point he returns to repeatedly, he emphasizes that this new material is specifically aggressively targeted at a female audience.
He sees that as a problem.
He views this not as an expansion of the genre's borders to include romance readers, but as a hostile takeover where the genre is being colonized by erotic content disguised as fantasy.
And I have to emphasize, he doesn't just make vague, hand-waving claims about the books being erotic. He gets incredibly, uncomfortably specific to prove his point to his audience that the genre has become, in his vocabulary, degenerate.
He really goes into the details.
This is where the video really escalates into providing extreme, visceral examples to justify his outrage. We are going to list exactly what the source details regarding the content of A Court of Flames because it's important to understand the evidence he is presenting.
Right, what does he highlight?
He points specifically to the relationship between the characters Nista and Cass. The video claims the book features multiple chapters-long scenes of BDSM-inspired encounters. The author explicitly lists descriptions of oral sex, penetration, dominance play, bodily fluids described in vivid anatomical detail, specific dialogue commands from the characters like hold on to the headboard, and detailed depictions of prolonged thrusting and orgasm.
He reads all this out.
He makes a massive point to tell his audience that readers have noted these incredibly explicit scenes occur every few chapters, fundamentally shifting the entire pacing and tone of the book away from anything resembling a fantasy and turning it into a purely erotic.
This raises an important question about how the author is actively attempting to persuade and frankly, agitate his audience. By listing these very graphic, visceral details aloud in his video, he is trying to evoke a profound sense of shock and disgust.
It definitely feels designed to shock.
He wants the viewer to feel that the boundaries of cultural acceptability have not just been crossed, but completely obliterated. He is trying to prove that his constant use of the word degenerate, which is a highly loaded term often used in cultural critiques to imply a decline from a higher moral standard, is objectively textually justified by the words on the page. He's saying, I'm not exaggerating, look at what is actually being printed.
I have to be honest, as I was reading the transcript, I thought that was as far as he was going to go, but he actually pushes it even further to show just how extreme and bizarre the market has gotten.
It's more extreme.
Oh, he brings up a book called Morning Glory Milking Farm. Now, he describes this to his audience as monster, where a human woman literally milks a minotaur, like a literal bull monster.
A minotaur.
Yes. And he points out with genuine, palpable disbelief that this book has risen to the top of the Amazon fantasy romance charts.
Yes, and we can acknowledge how bizarre that premise sounds while still objectively analyzing how he uses it in his argument. The inclusion of that specific extreme example serves a very distinct rhetorical purpose. It validates his slippery slope argument.
How so?
He is positing that because the market, which he consistently characterizes as women going crazy, for this level of pornography rewards explicit content with massive sales and chart-topping success, it creates a dangerous feedback.
The authors just write more of it.
Exactly. It encourages blockbuster authors like Maas and Arroz and newer independent authors as well to continually push the boundaries further and further into what he considers degeneracy just to capture that audience. He is painting a picture of an entire industry locked in a race to the bottom, driven by an insatiable, escalating market demand for ever more extreme transgressive content.
And he doesn't just blame the publishing world. He links this conditioning back to mainstream television, too. He points a finger directly at Game of Thrones.
That's a huge touchstone for fantasy.
Right. The video argues that the immense, unprecedented global popularity of Game of Thrones, which he categorizes simply as softcore fantasy porn, played a major foundational role in conditioning the modern market.
So HBO paved the way.
He claims that the show garnered rabid fan bases among what he calls the degenerate audience. And in doing so, it made the broader mainstream culture entirely comfortable with the marriage of high fantasy setting, explicit sexual content.
Exactly. He is connecting the dot between literature, premium cable television, and consumer behavior. He's arguing that a culture that has been accustomed to explicit visual media will inevitably demand that same level of explicit gratification from its literature, thereby corrupting the literary form entirely.
Which is actually a perfect conceptual bridge into the next major phase of his argument, Hollywood adaptation. Because, as he points out, these Romantasy books aren't just staying on the Barnes & Noble shelves, they are being actively turned into television shows and movies.
Right, the cycle continues.
The focus of the video shifts heavily to the planned Hollywood adaptation of Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Thorns and Roses. Del Arroz notes that Maas recently made industry news by buying back the film right prop, which is a rare move for him.
It really is.
And to dissect what this means, he pulls quotes directly from an interview Maas gave on a massively popular podcast called Call Her Dad.
It is really worth noting his immediate characterization of that podcast before he even gets to the quote. He refers to Call Her Daddy as another woman degenerate thing.
Right. He dismisses the entire platform instantly.
Precisely. He instantly attempts to discredit the platform and frame the entire impending conversation within his pre-established moral paradigm. He wants his audience to view anything said on that podcast as inherently suspect before he even analyzes the actual words.
So with that framing in place, he pulls specific quotes from Maas. In the interview, Maas says she wants to be in charge of the adaptation. She describes herself as a type A control.
Okay.
She says she wants to know everything about how it gets made because she genuinely loves movies and television, and she wants to see everything adapted exactly the way she envisions it in her head and the way the fans want it to be seen.
That sounds like standard author protectiveness.
It does. But the real kicker, the specific quote that the source zeroes in on like a laser, is Maas saying, "I don't ever want to hear we need to change that to appeal to XYZ demographic." She concludes that thought by stating definitively, that's not how you make art.
Now, here's where it gets really in, because the author of the video has a very complex, incredibly dual reaction to this interview. It's not a simple blanket condemnation like you might expect at this point in the video.
I was so surprised by this. On the surface level, he actually agrees with her sentiment.
He does, but only through his highly specific interpretation of her words.
Right. He believes creators should have absolute control over their work and that properties should be adapted faithfully to the source material. When Maas says she refuses to change things to appeal to XYZ demographic, the source interprets this through a very specific cultural lens.
How does he read it?
He takes it to mean that she is rejecting the common Hollywood practice of race-swapping character, which, for anyone unfamiliar, is when a character written as one race in the book is cast with an actor of a different race in the adaptation, often for diverses.
Wow.
Del Arroz assumes Maas is rejecting this practice, and his reaction to that specific, assumed interpretation highly positive. He actually uses internet slang and calls that stance pretty big.
But that moment of agreement is incredibly fleeting. He almost immediately pivots to what he calls the subtext of her interview. While he likes his interpretation of the XYZ demographic comment regarding casting, he believes the real reason she wants absolute type A control is to ensure that the graphic, explicit sexual scenes are not toned down, sanitized, or removed for a mainstream television audience.
He argues that when she says she wants the adaptation to be exactly as she envisioned it, she really means she wants the degenerate scenes presented in a purely pornographic manner on screen.
He's predicting the worst.
And he takes massive aggressive issue with her use of the word art. When Maas says changing things for demographics is not how you make art, Delarose force. He argues that her work is not beautiful art at all, but simply pop. He accuses the entire pop culture industry of constantly, deliberately conflating base smut with real elevated art.
This is a vital synthesis of his entire worldview up to this point. He is conflating literary merit, visual adaptation theory, and personal morality all into one single critique.
It's all tied together for him.
It is. He ultimately concludes that even though he supports an author's right to faithful adaptations in abstract theory, in this specific case, the film simply should not be made at all. He states that if anyone were to adapt it, they would have a moral obligation to strip out all the awful elements.
But then he contradicts himself again.
Right. He quickly follows that up by claiming the core bones of the story have no merit anyway, because the explicit content was the entire intention and the only selling point from the beginning. He is arguing that the intellectual property is fundamentally, structurally irredeemable.
And if you thought the argument was intense at this point, if you thought the stakes were high, this is where the video takes its absolute biggest leap. The jump we talked about at the beginning, we move into the cultural conspiracy and the elite.
Here we go.
The deep dive goes from critiquing a single author's television deal and a single bookstore display to making sweeping, alarming claims about the very fabric. Source argues massive shift toward romantasy is not just a market trend driven by sales data and consumer demand. He claims it is an intentional, orchestrated, top-down...
This is a classic, highly effective rhetorical escalation.
Yeah.
He moves from simply identifying a cultural phenomenon he dislikes to attributing active, malicious intent to the people producing. It's no longer just bad taste plot.
He brings up the young adult or YA section of bookstores. He reminds his audience that this section is ostensibly historically designed for teenagers and kids.
Right.
But he claims that if you go into that section now, today, it is entirely filled with what he describes as black, queer, throuple, polyamory. And he doesn't just point this out as a demographic. He asserts that the explicit purpose of putting this specific content in the YA section is to actively manipulate impressionable young women into adopting lifestyle.
We must carefully unpack his ultimate conclusion here, because the stakes he sets are apocalyptic. The source states explicitly that the goal of this manipulation is to destroy the family and destroys our culture.
That is a massive...
It is. He is claiming that there are degenerates in New York publishing, which is a very common boogeyman trope in anti-establishment rhetoric, and an unnamed shadowy elite who are actively pulling the strings behind the scenes.
The elite.
Yeah. He is framing the publishing of romance, explicit content, and diverse relationship dynamics not as capitalism meeting a new consumer demand, but as a deliberate, weaponized tactic deployed in a global culture war.
He even extends this conspiracy to encompass Sarah J. Maas herself, taking away her agency in a way. He suggests that Maas might not even fully understand the broader, sinister agenda she is allegedly a part of.
How does he explain that?
He posits that she might just have weird, degenerate porn fantasies that she personally enjoys, but that she is ultimately being controlled, elevated, and manipulated by this shadowy elite to achieve their overarching goals of culture. She's just a pawn in his narrative.
Again, we want to gently remind you, the listener, of our impartial framing here. These are the explicit viewpoints and conspiracy theories presented by the author of the video. They reflect a profound, deep-seated, and highly articulated distrust of mainstream culture institutions, the traditional publishing industry, and Hollywood.
We are laying out his argument in detail so you can see exactly how he logically connects a complaint about a Barnes & Noble shelf to a grand theory about the intentional, orchestrated collapse of family.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is truly fascinating to see how the source bridges that massive gap. Think about the psychology of why this leap works for a specific audience.
The journey.
It starts with a relatively benign literary critique. He prefers hard magic to romance plots in fantasy, which appeals to a sense of nostalgia for older readers. Then, once they're nodding along, he ends up with a full-blown culture war narrative where the stakes are the survival of civilization itself.
It pulls you right in.
It is a massive, carefully constructed escalation designed to make the viewer feel that simply reading a certain type of widely popular book is a profound moral failure, and opposing that book is a righteous moral crusade.
Which leads us perfectly, almost inevitably, into the final section of his video. Because in any rhetorical structure that presents a massive apocalyptic problem where the sky is falling and the industry is entirely ruined, the speaker almost always follows up a proposed solution. He doesn't just leave his viewers in despair.
No, he offers a way out.
And in this case, the antidote he offers is incredibly specific and highly personal.
Exactly. After spending 20 minutes detailing the absolute moral decay and artistic corruption of the mainstream fantasy industry, the author concludes by directly pitching his own books as the singular cure for this cultural blight.
It's an incredible pivot.
It's a textbook pivot.
Yeah.
The entire structure of the argument necessitates this conclusion. He has created a void of acceptable media, and now he must fill it.
The source material lists out his own credentials very specifically to contrast himself with the slop he just spent the video describing. He promotes his own series called The Adventures of Baron von Monley.
Okay.
He tells the audience it's a massive 6-book series, and he's currently 70% done with book 7, proving his work ethic. He highlights his commercial success outside the mainstream system, claiming over 30,000 copies sold.
Setting himself up as the alternative.
Right. And most importantly, he explicitly contrasts his content with the Romantasy trend. He promises his potential readers deep world building with thousands of years of history, real action, and real traditional adventure.
Let's analyze the rhetorical brilliance or perhaps the sheer audacity of this strategy. By framing the entire mainstream publishing industry as morally corrupt, artistically bankrupt, and actively hostile to traditional values, he is doing so much more than just marketing a book.
What is he doing?
He is positioning his own self-published independent work not merely as an alternative entertainment perch, but as a moral imperative.
It's a funnel. He gives a very direct call to action. He asks his viewers to become Subscribe Star supporters. Now, for anyone unfamiliar, Subscribe Star is a crowdfunding platform similar to Patreon, but it is often heavily favored by creators and audiences who feel alienated, restricted, or censored by more mainstream tech platforms.
It fits the outsider narrative perfectly.
It perfectly fits his narrative of operating outside the corrupt elite system. He pushes his newsletter, which is linked in the video description, offering 3 free books as a sign-up, and he frames his financial support as joining a
crusade.
He says the ultimate goal is to build a good culture around good science fiction and fantasy, combat what's going on. Buying his book, subscribing to his page, becomes an act of cultural defiance.
Precisely. He is looking at the camera and telling his audience that they are under active attack by the elite, their culture is being systematically destroyed by degenerate media, and the single most effective way to fight back on the front lines of this culture war is to fund his writing career. It completely transforms a basic consumer transaction into an act of ideological alignment and resistance.
I want to pause and ask you, the listener, to really consider this dynamic. Think about how you process the media you consume. How often do you see media critiques online, on YouTube, on social media that spend 20 or 30 minutes tearing down a popular mainstream piece of
diagnosing it as a symptom of societal decay.
Right, only to ultimately serve as a sales funnel for the critic's own competing product or their Patreon or their Subscribe Star page. It's a very common, highly lucrative, and incredibly effective economic system built entirely on
it. Absolutely is a well-oiled ecosystem, and recognizing the mechanics of that ecosystem is crucial to modern media literacy. When the person loudly identifying the deadly cultural disease is also the person selling the only known cure, it fundamentally changes how we must evaluate their initial diagnosis.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today, and I think we really tore into the mechanics of this art. Let's do a quick recap of the incredible journey this deep dive has taken us on.
It was a long trip.
It really was. We started with a very localized visual complaint about the physical shelves at a Barnes & Noble being overrun by romance. From there, we traced the source's argument that this corrupt the fantasy genre didn't happen overnight, but began with the specific mechanics of 50 Shades of Grey evolved Twilight fandom.
The fanfic pipe.
We looked at the visceral, graphic, explicit examples to try and prove the genre has objectively degenerate. We analyzed his complex, seemingly contradictory reaction to Hollywood adaptation rights and the idea of creative via the Sarah J. Maas interview.
The call her daddy quote.
Right. We unpacked his sweeping, apocalyptic claims about a shadowy elite conspiracy designed to destroy the nuclear family unit through young adult literature. And finally, we ended with his masterful pivot, pitching his own independent fantasy series not just as a book, but as the moral alternative to cultural collapse.
So what does this all mean when we put the pieces together? When we step back and look at the entirety of this video transcript, it really reflects how deeply personal, fraught, and fiercely contested the boundaries of genre fiction have become in the modern era.
It's more than just books.
Genres are not just simple marketing categories slapped on the spine of a book. For many devoted readers and writers, they are tightly knit communities with deeply held shared values, histories, and expectations. When those boundaries shift, as they undeniably, visibly have with the massive, unprecedented explosion of Romantasy, it causes real, palpable friction.
Growing pains.
Exactly. Some view it as an exciting, lucrative evolution that brings new readers into the fold, while others, like the author of our source material, view it as an existential, orchestrated threat to the genre and perhaps the culture they love.
It really leaves us with a fascinating, provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up. We want to leave you with this question to explore on your own, thinking about the books on your own shelf.
What's the question?
When a subgenre, like Romantasy, becomes wildly, unprecedentedly successful and begins to physically dominate the market shelves, does it actually redefine the genre itself for a completely new generation of readers? Or does it simply reflect what massive, previously ignored segments of the audience have secretly wanted all along, but traditional publishers were simply too afraid or too traditional to print? Ultimately, in a global market driven by millions of readers voting with their wallets, who really gets to gatekeep what constitutes real fantasy?
That is the perfect question to end on. It challenges us to think deeply about the constant, evolving relationship between art, commerce, and the true desires of the audience.
Thank you so much for joining us. Heavy, loved, unpacked our questions.